Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some huge trade news coming out of the San Jose Sharks camp today, and that is that the Sharks have traded away goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood, as well as forward Givani Smith and a 5th-round pick in 2027 to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for goaltender Alexander Georgiev, forward Nikolai Kovalenko, a 2nd-round pick in 2026, and a conditional 5th-round pick in 2025. We'll start off first with the couple of smaller assets that the Sharks gave up in this deal. The 5th-round pick in 2027 is essentially equalized by the one that they are getting back from this year. On top of that, it has the possibility of becoming a 4th-round pick if some conditions are met. Depends on how many games Blackwood plays, as well as how many wins he picks up over the rest of this season, or if the Avalanche are able to make it to the 3rd round of the playoffs. I believe 2 of those 3 conditions do need to be met, but whether this becomes a 4th-round pick or it does not doesn't really change the fact that this is a pretty inconsequential draft pick swap. The forward that the Sharks are giving up also doesn't really move the needle all that much. He has played a couple of games for the Sharks this season, but he's not an impact player, and in fact, San Jose had actually just put him on waivers yesterday, and he went unclaimed today. One might be asking why the Avalanche wouldn't have just picked him up off of waivers for free instead of picking him up in this trade. It does need to be mentioned that if they had done so, he would have had to remain with their NHL team. He would have had to be with Colorado, but because he has cleared waivers and now they are trading for him, he can go directly to the minors. He could help bolster their AHL team's toughness. But realistically, this is a move that is just equalizing the contract situation here, since the Sharks are getting that extra forward in Kovalenko. The real asset that San Jose is giving up, obviously here on paper, is goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. I have gotten many questions over these last few weeks of whether or not I thought the Sharks would and even should trade Blackwood this season, and I had always answered the same thing, or very similar things, which is that if the correct trade comes along, if there is enough value out there, Mike Grier would be a little bit silly to not accept it, and it seems as though he has actually gotten the deal that he wants. Perhaps the most recent performance of Blackwood just a couple of days ago against the Panthers, where he faced over 50 shots and only let in 3 goals, is what really put things over the top here and allowed Colorado to come knocking. But as one of the best goaltenders who is currently available for a trade, he's been one of the better goalies just in general all around the league. It's not surprising that people would be interested and that the Sharks would actually get some pretty decent value back in return. I know there were a lot of people who were kind of hoping for the Sharks to run an Askarov-Blackwood tandem into the future here for San Jose, but it should be noted that while Blackwood will obviously not be finishing this season with the team, that he is on an expiring contract, which means if the Sharks, and more importantly if Blackwood, really feel strongly about it, the Sharks could just sign him to a contract this offseason and then bring him back. That is a move that they could make. So if that is something that is in the cards, it'll happen, but perhaps they have just now moved on. And Blackwood has performed exceptionally well for San Jose, and they will be very happy with the fact that they traded just a 6th-round pick to pick him up, and they've ended up getting back the amount of assets that they did. So let us now talk about what indeed the Sharks got back here. I already mentioned that conditional 5th rounder. Another draft pick that they got was a 2nd rounder in 2026. Now, of course, the Colorado Avalanche are expected to be a good team next season as well, as they usually are, and so this will end up being a late 2nd rounder, likely in the 50s, and I know there were some people who were potentially thinking a 1st-round pick could be here for Blackwood, and while the Sharks won't be getting that in terms of draft capital, they will potentially be getting a pretty good player. But before we get into him, let us first also discuss Georgiev. So he is the goaltender coming back here. He was the starter for Colorado coming into this season, who they were planning on leaning on, but to not really sugarcoat anything, Georgiev has been one of, if not the worst goaltender in the entire league this season. He has been just downright horrible, and so obviously Colorado couldn't hope to even make the playoffs, never mind compete in the playoffs with him at the helm, and so they needed to trade him. And in this goalie for goalie swap, which is something that we usually do see in these types of trades, the Sharks are obviously getting back the worst player. However, it's not necessarily the end of the world. The first thing that we should be saying is that this is on a 1-year contract. His contract does expire at the end of this year, so it's not as though the Sharks are saddled with multiple years of a terrible goaltender with them. On top of that, while Georgiev has been really bad this season, he was actually kind of middle of the pack last year, and even one of the better goalies in the league 2 seasons ago. And so it is not completely out of the question that Georgiev, with the change of scenery, could end up rebounding and actually putting on a solid performance over these next couple of months. Perhaps just with the amount of shots that he is likely to face with the San Jose Sharks, that could maybe help round his game back into form. If that is the case, there is an outside chance that the Sharks could also trade him away before the deadline to pick up even more value from him. I don't know if that's how possible that really will be. A lot of teams probably won't be willing to bet their playoff futures on a goaltender who started as terribly as he has over these first couple of months. So this is kind of more of like a hopeful type of dream scenario, but it is still a possibility. The perhaps more conspiratorial view of this type of goalie for goalie swap is that the Sharks, yes, their last couple of games have been really bad against Tampa and Florida, but the few games prior to that, the Sharks were actually looking a good bit better. And ever since they lost their first 9 games of the season, they've actually been a more middle-of-the-pack team across the entire NHL. And perhaps this isn't something that Mike Grier was looking for. Obviously, he has made multiple moves this past offseason to try and improve the Sharks from where they were last year, which was the literal worst team of the salary cap era, but he probably doesn't want them to actually get even remotely close to a playoff spot. And so by moving away Blackwood, who had been performing so well for San Jose, and picking up a goaltender who has been as bad as Georgiev has, is really going to end up tanking the Sharks' performances moving over the rest of this season. And so a potential, maybe 8th, 9th, last place finish for the San Jose Sharks, if things actually continue to look up for them, has now fallen further down to perhaps continuing to be that basement team and trying to get a good draft pick. Again, I don't know really, this might just be more of a pessimistic and cynical view of what Mike Grier could have been going for in this type of trade, but one cannot dismiss the fact that this will definitely make the Sharks a worse team. On top of that, as a final point here with Georgiev, there were a lot of people who were hoping that if Blackwood did get traded, it would be to open up a slot on the roster for Askarov to come up and have him be either the 1A, 1B starter with Vanecek, or perhaps even just be the starting goaltender for the Sharks this season. I'm pretty sure Askarov was probably hoping for that himself, but with Georgiev being brought in, it seems quite clear that this was not in the Sharks' plans this season, that they are likely expecting Askarov to be up there with the Sharks at the very least, potentially as the starter next year, but that they want to keep him mostly in the minors this year to help the Barracuda get back to the playoffs and perhaps also help them lead to a strong playoff performance. And so it will likely be a tandem of Vanecek and Georgiev for the foreseeable future. I don't know if either of these two goaltenders will actually be movable in a trade, and I highly doubt Grier would be willing to waive them or to run 3 goaltenders. So it seems as though the Askarov hype train is still going to be waiting in the station, perhaps until next year, or at the very least, at the earliest, past the trade deadline. Now, the most interesting asset picked up by the Sharks in this trade does have to be forward Nikolai Kovalenko. The second round pick is good value and is nice, but it's not really all that interesting to talk about. And of course, Georgiev is essentially a wash. He's not a very good goaltender, at least this year, but Kovalenko definitely has some potential. Now, he is a rookie, but it does need to be sort of further explained here, because many people will view a rookie as like a 19, 20-year-old plucky up-and-comer, but he is 25 years of age, which is technically a rookie by NHL standards, but not one that many would view as such. However, it does still fit into that age window that the Sharks are looking for. To put this into perspective, Fabian Zetterlund with the Sharks, who many consider to be part of the Sharks' young core, is also 25 years of age, and in fact is a couple of months older than Kovalenko, and so he is definitely in that potential window. He had previously played many of his seasons in the KHL, which is one of the better hockey leagues around the world, and he was putting up really good performances, close to a point per game. Just 2 years ago, at the age of 23, he actually led his team in terms of points. So he has been performing very, very well in those particular areas. His transition to the NHL hasn't gone fully smoothly. He has 8 points in 28 games, but he has also kind of been bouncing around the lineup and hasn't really been given a full-time home with Colorado. He has averaged about 12 minutes of ice time this season, but while there have been games in which he's gotten up to like 15 plus, there have also been many games this season where he has gotten not even the double-digit mark at like just 8 to even down to like 6 minutes per game. And while he has had moments playing with their big name players, he actually spent some time with both McKinnon and Rantanen, at the time on the exact same line, at times with just Mikko Rantanen, but that has only accounted for about 15% of his current even strength ice time, so it hasn't necessarily been something that's really been left to marinate a little bit, and he has shown flashes of being a pretty decent player. Based on the reaction from many Colorado Avalanche fans, a lot lot of the time when it comes to these certain players who are not obviously big names in the NHL, teams are very quick to turn on the players that they're trading away and say, oh, well, they never really had any value anyway, to try and make themselves feel better about the fact that they're trading a player away. But it seems as though a lot of Avalanche fans are actually somewhat disappointed with the fact that Kovalenko is being moved on from. He does have that younger fit, as I mentioned, into the Sharks window, and so he could be a player of the future if he can find a home here with San Jose. And there obviously is going to be more opportunities with the Sharks, considering Colorado, they don't really have the time to allow players to find their footing because they want to make the playoffs, and they have been struggling to do so thus far this season because of their terrible goaltending. For the Sharks, who don't really have those playoff aspirations, they can give more of a closer look to Kovalenko. And so the question becomes, where does he actually fit into the Sharks lineup? Because the Sharks have been running a pretty set top 9 over these last few games. That was perhaps going to change after these last couple of performances against both Florida and Tampa, but currently the Sharks have Celebrini, Eklund, and Zetterlund, then Cunnin, Wenberg, and Toffoli, and then a third line of Will Smith with Granlund and Kostin. So the obvious substitution here is to boot Cunnin out of the top 9. As solid as he has been in that role, he's clearly not really a top 9 player, while Kovalenko does have the potential to be one, and so he could take up that spot with Wenberg or Toffoli, or perhaps even end up on a line with either Granlund or perhaps even Celebrini, and we can see if the Sharks want to go with that direction and how well he can perform with hopefully some increase of ice time. Now, what this does add to the lineup is the fact that this is another player who the Sharks would want to actually play. Givani Smith was not that, and as we know, there are a lot of names for the Sharks here on their roster. If he indeed does take that top 9 slot from Cunnin and boots Cunnin down to the fourth line, the fourth line was already pretty solid at Sturm, Dellandrea, and Grundstrom. So if Cunnin, let's say, replaces Grundstrom and Grundstrom ends up at the healthy scratch, they could run with that, but as we know as well, Goodrow is pretty close to returning from his injury. Does he take the spot of Ty Dellandrea? This name definitely does complicate some things for the San Jose Sharks, and there will be a lot of decision points to be made, but I do hope that if the Sharks did go out of their way to pick up Kovalenko, they're going to give him a real shot of actually finding some space in this Sharks lineup. If they have him just play like a game or two on a fourth line and then have him be as a healthy scratch, I don't understand why they would have even bothered to pick him up. So this is likely a move that is being made to hopefully bring in a player who could become a real impact guy. Maybe not as a top liner, maybe even not necessarily as a second liner, but as a scoring third liner. That could be a very big boost to the Sharks moving into the future. You know, it's not always the big name guys that are going to be those difference makers. Sometimes it is indeed those bottom 6 players who can still add value to their lineup at a relatively cheap amount. But that would do it for this trade review. I would say that this is a mostly positive trade here for San Jose. Blackwood was someone on an expiring contract that it would make a lot of sense for San Jose to trade, and so the fact that they pick up not only a second round pick but also someone with a decent amount of potential is a pretty tidy bit of work for Greer. Class dismissed.